All right, so I have my yarn. I'm using 5mm straight bamboo needles. I like to start beginners, especially kids, off with wooden needles. They have a little bit more grab, and so they hold onto the stitches a little bit better, I find, whereas metal needles tend to have it glide off, and so it can be frustrating when you're first learning how to knit to have those stitches fall off. I know when I started, I hated it, and as soon as I would drop a stitch, I would dump the entire project because I didn't know how to go back and fix them. So hopefully you're not going to be in that situation after you finish watching my beginner knitting videos. So the first thing we're going to do is cast on, and that means put some stitches on one of our needles to begin with so we can start knitting those stitches and start building up our project. So to start with any project, you'll have to have a slip knot. And now for the cast on, I'm going to do a long tail cast on. There are dozens and dozens of different ways that you can get stitches onto your needles. But this, I think, is probably what we would be called a traditional cast on. So for that, you need to have a tail long enough that it's going to be more than what you'll need to make the number of stitches that you need. So I'll give you an example. And I always like to show everything visually. So if I start with just a little tail like this, and I make a slip knot here. To do the slip knot, I put 2 fingers behind the yarn. I wrap it around my fingers 1 full rotation. Then I tuck these fingers in my hand, slip the yarn under, and carefully pull up on that. And that's how I get a little loop for my slip knot. Now to know that you've done a slip knot correctly, if you pull on both ends, it should just go back down to straight like that. So again, I wrap it around twice, fold my fingers back, tuck the tail under the wrapped yarn, and pull up so I have a little loop here. So first I'm just going to show you what I mean by the tail. If you start off with just a little tail like this and the pattern calls for casting on 30 stitches, you're going to see what's going to happen. I'm going to show you what happens first, then I'll slow it down and show you how to properly cast on. So this is the tail end I'm working with, and I know it's not going to be enough to cast on 30 stitches, but I like to show you what happens. I have 2. I'm going to keep going till I can't no more. So I have 8 stitches on here, and look what happens. As you make the cast on stitches, this tail also gets shorter. You're pulling from your working yarn, which is the yarn end that's still connected to the ball, so I have plenty here, but the tail end that you started from the other side of the slip knot also gets shortened. So you can see that I'm at 8 and I'm trying to do 9. I'm running out of tail here, and there's no way that I'll be able to get 30. This is going to run out in the next stitch or 2. So you see what I mean? Where you start with your slip knot, you need to have made the slip knot far enough in from this end that however many cast on stitches you need to have on there can be made with this tail end. So let me pull out a little bit more. And there's a lot of different ways that you can measure that. We're just going to keep everything rough, simple, easy, just to get you started. It can be overwhelming to have this much information thrown at you at once. So again, I have a good bit here, and I'm going to make my slip knot, wrap them around my fingers, fold those fingers under, tuck the yarn under here, and pop it up here. So that's my slip knot. Now, I slip my needle into the knot, and then remember, you can pull on both ends to get it to go a little bit more snug to your needle. All right, so the needle is through the slip knot. We have this end connected to our ball of yarn, and this end is the tail end, all right, that's shorter. So to start casting on, I bring my thumb and pointer in here, I open it, and then with these 3 fingers, I'm going to grab it down here. So pointer and thumb inside here. With the last 3 fingers, I grab the 2 tail ends, and I kind of make it look like this, like the top of a triangle. Okay? Then I turn my hand, almost like if I was pulling back a slingshot like this. Okay? You know how we would go like this over your thumb and pointer finger? So you're going to do that. Hold on to the slip knot on here. And I just take the tip of the needle. I go underneath this one, over that one, and look where I'm coming through in between these 2 here. And what happens is you create this kind of loop-de-loop going on here that when you tug on these 2 tails, it cinches up the stitch that you've now created and put it right on your needle. So I'm going to do it again a few more times, and then I'll slow it down in slow motion for you to see. So thumb and pointer, pull it back like this, like you were doing a slingshot. That way you know you have the correct orientation. The tip of the needle under here, make it scrape your thumb, come over the top of the one that's draped over the pointer finger, and you're dragging that yarn through here. Okay, you see where that is, where my thumb is? I'm gonna grab it and swipe it through here. Then I can take my thumb and my pointer finger out, and you can see that's what's created as I cinch it in. It's now put a third cast on stitch on my needle. All right, so that is the long tail cast on. You would cast on however many stitches your pattern calls for. I'm gonna go ahead and cast on 15 so I can show you how you would go into these cast on stitches and knit your first row. All right, so I've gone ahead and cast on 15 stitches. Remember that the slip knot does count as a cast on stitch, so don't forget to count that in your total. So now I have 15 on here. Now let's grab our second needle so I can show you how to orient them, and you can start knitting into these stitches to start your project. All right, so the cast on stitches are here. I'm going to flip it. So now that tip is pointing to the right, and I'll take my other needle here on the right side also. So the two tips should be pointing together. You'll have stops on both ends of these straight needles that will keep the stitches from falling off in that direction. Then it's up to you and your fingers to keep the stitches from falling off this tapered end. All right, so first I'm gonna show you how to knit, all right? You're gonna do the knit stitch. The American or English way or flicking or throwing, it's called a bunch of different things. You basically are gonna tension the yarn in your right hand. Okay, now number one mistake, some people will start grabbing this tail end yarn and start using it to knit. You're obviously going to run out of yarn whenever the tail end ends. So make sure that before you grab the yarn to knit the first stitch, that you look and see that you're grabbing the longer yarn that's still connected to your working ball. So to knit, hold your stitches like this. I have all the little bobbles underneath here that basically cinched up against it. You see how the top of the needle has them smooth? This side, it's more textured. Put that edge down, and then I'm going to grab the tip of my second needle and I'm going to slip it from front to back on the first stitch. Okay, so again here, and now with this finger hold it there. You're basically making an X, right? And then with your right hand, grab the working yarn, wrap it around that back needle, which is the one you just inserted, and then you're going to pull it under and up. So now you have a stitch on this needle, and this is the stitch that we were working on that other needle. So go ahead and slide it off. So now you've worked your first knit stitch, and the way that knitting works is that you're knitting each one of these stitches, and as you work them, you're making them taller, and as you work each one, they end up coming over to this right hand needle. So let's try it again. I'm going to put my needle in from front to back, making an X. Holding the two needles together there with this left hand. With my right hand, I'm going to grab my working yarn and wrap around. So I'm wrapping behind and in between that X. And then I'm bringing the right needle forward as I brought the little yarn bit there over with me. And then to separate the needles, you have to take that stitch off of the left hand needle that you just worked. So again, from front to back, grab the yarn, wrap the back needle in between the X's where this yarn is coming out from, okay? Don't wrap it over both. And then we're going to come forward with the back needle, pulling up the little loop of yarn, and then to separate them, slide it off the tip of the left needle. So 1, 2, 3 tells me I've worked 3 knit stitches, and here they are. Now, you're going to continue across doing that the whole way across, and this would be your knit stitches. All right, and this is how I taught my kids to knit. So I think it's a really beginner-friendly technique. They're 9 and 7, and they can knit and purl. When you finish working an entire row and you slide that last stitch off the left-hand needle, now it's empty. You haven't done anything wrong. It's still right. So now sometimes you'll see that it wants to go like this. Turn it so that all this textured edge, all those stitches that you worked, are running along the bottom edge of your knitting needle. This will help orient everything correctly for you. You see? I know that this all needs to look like this, and that way if this yarn is draped back, I know that it's not correct. Bring it down so that you keep the exact number of stitches that you should have. Anytime that you wrap the yarn around your needle, you're gonna end up adding on another stitch. You see how if I did that, I've added another stitch on there, which is not true. It shouldn't be there, all right? So make sure that you tug on this down just to make sure everything is falling right in place. And don't worry if that first stitch is a little bit loose. That tends to happen often. No big deal. So I knit my first row. Now we'll go back and knit the exact same row. We're just going to knit again, but I'm going to show you how to knit continental style or picking or European style. A lot of different terms, but again, what it is different to how I just showed you is that you're tensioning the yarn. Instead of grabbing it from the right, you're holding it with your left hand here. So I'm holding the stitches that need to be worked in my left hand with the point pointing right. And I have the empty needle here, which I'm going to start using this needle to work these stitches. And as I work them, remember what happens. All these stitches will end up in this needle next. And you just keep going back and forth with each row when you're using straight needles like this. All right, so for continental, the yarn is going to be here with my left hand. There's a lot of different ways to hold it. I'm showing you two different ways just so you can play around with it, whatever feels most comfortable. Now, I did start crocheting since I was 9 years old, and a lot of times you'll hear people teaching knitting say, well, if you're used to crochet, it's going to be easier for you to do continental because you also hold the yarn in your left hand when you crochet and you're right-handed, right? Well, I find that that's not necessarily true because when we're knitting, we're using needles that have a pointed, like tapered tip. There is no hook on the end of this. So it really does take some time to get used to grabbing the yarn with a straight tip. We're used to in crochet that it has a hook. And so yes, we do hold the yarn in our left hand, but when I go in to take a stitch with a crochet hook, the hook automatically catches so I can go pretty quickly. In knitting, when you first start off doing continental, it's not gonna go that fast. So let me show you how you would do it the continental or European way. You're still going to insert your needle in the exact same place. So from front to back, making an X, okay? But you're gonna use the tip of the right hand needle to go under, okay, the yarn and bring it through that stitch like this. And then you're still gonna take it off of the left hand needle. All right, so you're gonna go through the same place, but grab it with the tip of the right needle and bring the yarn over and slide it off. So I'm in a kind of awkward position, and clearly you can tell that this is not how I normally knit, but just to give you the idea, you go through and you're bringing the yarn through and under that stitch with the tip of the needle. So because there's no hook there, those of you that crochet, I don't want you to think that it's you that can't do it. They're telling you falsely because there's no hook on the end. So it does take a little bit more fine motor skills to work the tip of that needle in order to grab that yarn and bring it forward and then slide the stitch off. So I'll go a little bit slower, just hopefully you can see what I'm doing. Needle goes in from front to back. I catch the yarn on the back end and I'm bringing it through underneath the stitch from here and then slide it off of the needle. So again, through, grab the yarn and bring it out with you and slide the stitch off. All right, so let me finish doing this row. And then I'll show you what we have so we can move on. All right, so now all the stitches, this was my right hand needle. Now I'm gonna flip it. It will become my left hand needle so I can go back and work my way this way. Now when you're starting off and you're practicing both the American or English way and then the continental way, I would suggest that you make swatches all done one way and make another swatch all done the other way. What I've done in the past is like, I want to practice. Let me practice both ways. And I notice that my tension is completely different with each style. And so I end up with longer, more open stitches on some parts when I'm stitching continental. And then if I'm stitching, or excuse me, if I'm knitting American or English style and throwing, my tension seems to be a lot tighter. So work swatches up in each style as you practice and find the best and easiest way for you to tension your yarn and work your stitches, and then decide from there what you want to do as you choose your projects. All right, so I'll leave you with that. Go ahead and just knit every row, and believe it or not, you're ready to start a project just with some knit stitches. In a future video, I'll show you how to do a purl stitch, and then we'll start tackling some different projects. But with a knit stitch, if you knit every row, you're gonna end up with what we call garter stitch. And I will do a few more rows and meet you back here so you can see what the little swatch of garter stitch would be. And that just means that I'm doing knit stitches in every stitch, both on the right side and on the wrong side. So every time I turn my needle and I flip them to get ready to work the stitches in the other direction, I'm just knitting every single stitch. So very repetitive, very zen, and it's so relaxing. So here is the start of a little garter stitch sample that I've been knitting up. Remember, I'm knitting and knitting back, knitting and knitting back. Every single stitch I see, no matter what needle it's on, I'm knitting in both directions, on the right side and the wrong side of my fabric. You can see that it doesn't roll like the stockinette stitch does. All right? And it looks the same on both sides. Super cool. You can make an entire scarf just out of garter stitch, okay? So pretty simple and ready for you to get started with what I've taught you so far. The stockinette stitch here, you can see that it's different. It's knit, all knit on the right side, and every time we flip it and knit a wrong side row, we have to purl stitch the wrong side row of it, okay? So you can see how the garter stitch is a combination of both the knit stitch and the purl stitch, because when you make a knit stitch, the right side shows like these stitches, but the wrong side is a purl. So if I knit this way, I can see in here my knit stitches. Then I knit the other way around, right, on the back side of the fabric. So what's showing up next is the purl side. And so it alternates from front to back. So you get this fabric that's created with garter stitch. If I spread it out like that, you can see it a little better where the knit stitches are in here and the purl stitches are here, because I knit across the back. So on the front side, it shows you purl. So that's, I don't even know if that makes any sense, but that's what happens. You're knitting every stitch on the front and the back. So whenever you're knitting on the back, you're popping up purls on the front side of the work. And when you're knitting on the front, the purls are popping up on the back. So you end up with one row knit, one row purl, one row knit, one row purl, and they kind of gather up like this to make what we call garter stitch, okay? So that is with the knit stitch across every single stitch. You'll get a look like this, which is a great place for beginners to start. In a future video, I will share with you how to make stockinette stitch like this, where you're knitting across the right side or the front of the fabric, and then I'll teach you how to purl. What you working on?
A hat.
What kind of yarn is that?
Wool.
And who dyed it?
Me.
Let me see. Black, white, yellow. Why did you choose those colors?
Because it represents Pikachu colors and this other Pokemon called Umbreon.
Cool. And what part of the hat are you working on now?
The ribbing.
So what kind of stitches do you have to do for the ribbing?
2 knit and 2 purl.
Yep. And what's the most important part to remember when you switch from knitting to purling?
So if you just finished knitting or purling, so for purling you have to have the yarn in the front,
okay,
and for knitting you have to have the yarn in the back.
Excellent.